Thanks for being on screen and sharing your beautiful face, Josh. Name a suit, Josh. I'm going to go through one of the suits. We'll do swords. I had a sword. Okay. Cool. So sorry that you guys couldn't hear Josh. That's too bad. I think one of the most important things when you're learning tarot and when you're first learning tarot is to really get a grasp of the elements. Just the 4 Greek elements that are represented by each of the 4 suits in the tarot. Because the tarot offers this really cool system where we break everything apart into 4 different sectors of human experience. And I asked Josh to pick one of the suits for me that I would go over today in our live stream now. And we'll go with that. We'll go with swords. The swords really are all about everything mental. They're our air element. And it's interesting. Each tarot card really kind of talks about a really small part of human experience, and none of them are kind of a complete picture of everything that we are, that we experience on their own. They're not really meant to be. They're one part of, like, the whole over 70 card deck. And each of these 4 suits kind of talk about, the different sectors of our life. And the air element, or our swords, are all referring to our mental facilities, which is a lot of where we do a lot of our decision making. They're very heady, not very emotional, although they talk about a lot of things that have a lot of bearing on our emotional experience. And I'll get into that as we go over the set. And they're really they're concerned with things like right or wrong, morals and value judgments, and anything that we do to make sense about things that are. Oftentimes swords and kind of cups talk about things that don't necessarily exist. These are all just about thoughts. Thoughts don't really exist. They're just in our head. They're just how we make sense of the world. And it's really interesting. You could have a certain thought or a feeling if we were talking about water and cups, but for now I'm going to keep it to thoughts with air and swords. And if you try to lay that over anything, you could feel or think a certain way about anything. I could have a card, and the card inspires a certain thought in me. I think a lot about cards, but to one person, there was that con artist that screwed me way back, and cards make me think that's got to be an evil person, and I see this and I think of a beautiful divinatory tool. And in reality, it's just a card. The point is that we're talking about the mental realm where we're fixing our thoughts over top things. And every set starts with the ace, of course. And all the aces kind of share this common element of being the new beginning of this set, and in this case it's new ideas, a new way of thinking about things, a new mindset, a new direction, or a new way to approach something. The Ace of Swords really resembles getting these kind of fresh perspectives. It kind of often is characterized as an enlightening space, the character of what's described in the Ace of Swords. It's a cool, fun card. It spurs you off on a new idea. And the fun thing about going over a whole set of cards like this in tarot is that there's kind of a story told across all the ranks. And kind of understanding the story and how it plays out will really help you understand each card individually, because it kind of fits in to the greater narrative here. So when you're seeing a card appear to you in a reading, understanding what that card comes out of and what it moves into can really offer a lot of clarity. Whenever I go over a set, I like to think of a fun analogy so I can tell a story as we do. And I think this Ace of Swords is going to be about, I'm going to come up with a story. You've been having trouble with a relationship with a coworker, and you've just got this new idea of how to approach that coworker. There's this, you just had this moment of, aha, I've been maybe setting aside my own needs too much and not valuing them in my relationship with this coworker, And it just occurred to me that I could bring them up in a serious way. And to me, this was a revelation. This was a new idea. It was something that I feel like I could capture in the description of the Ace of Swords. Usually whenever you have a new way of thinking about things, the progression is going to take you into our second in the set, which is the, okay, well, what do you do about it question. Do you put your new thoughts into practice? Do you keep going the old way that you didn't like? And the Two of Swords kind of describes a situation when you had to choose between two difficult and sometimes less than desirable options. And in the analogy that I'm working through here, I've got this coworker that is just a pain, but they're my superior, and I've been nervous about approaching them about I really want to be treated differently, and it's I don't know, it doesn't matter. I'm just trying to be professional, and that's the kind of situation you find yourself here in the Two of Swords, where you're weighing the option between, do I take the plunge and tell them, stop being a jerk to me, I don't want to deal with it anymore, I really want to work together differently, which has risk involved. And there's a big element in the Two of Swords that kind of underscores this feels like a risky or is a risky choice, having to choose between these options, and nothing feels desirable. You kind of sit there stuck, blindfolded, and trying to hope that the answer will become clear, and oftentimes it doesn't. I think the blindfold there's a blindfold on the person in the picture here, and that's common in a lot of decks that follow the Rider-Waite-Smith theme. I find that a lot of times it's not clear when you're at this phase. This early in the cycle, it's not clear to you yet which way is worse between the options ahead of you. And that makes this choice even more paralyzing. The Two of Swords kind of describes having to make a difficult choice, and it's your own choice to make. And usually in the Two of Swords, there's an underscore that if you do nothing, the choice will be made for you, usually in a way that's even worse. I mentioned choices and decision making before we leapt into the whole set of swords as a whole. That's a theme that comes through a lot through the air element, and is going to keep coming up here. Anyone that's a little familiar with tarot knows the Three of Swords. It's one of the more, look at that kind of cards in the deck. It's got swords through a heart, and it literally resembles the experience of heartache and of just regret. It kind of illustrates how in the two, you had to make a hard choice and do something that you didn't necessarily want to do. I had to either confront my coworker or suck it up and deal with it. Neither of these are going to feel good whether I do them. And this is the reality of, it didn't feel good. I did it and it doesn't feel good. It's happening now. I've taken the plunge in the Two of Swords, made my choice. I confronted my coworker, and it was hard. It brought up the hurt. They were kind of a jerk about it too. Just not necessarily the most understanding or whatever, but we're getting through it now. Now we're in it. Now there's action. There's a lot of action in the Three of Swords. Stuff is happening in the Three of Swords. There's kind of this progression. I think all the suits actually have a nice little break in their 1, 2, 3, where you've got here's the new idea. Here's me considering the new idea. Here's the resolution of me putting it into practice that's happening. And I want to remind us all about how I was talking about the swords resemble what we think about what's happening, and they touch on a little of what we feel, but they aren't always about what's actually happening. I had that conversation with my coworker, and it rattled my nerves to confront them like that. And they weren't immediately supportive, and that didn't make it easier. And I ended up feeling like this. I was worried about stirring the pot and getting conflict, and that's, of course, what I got. I knew that's what was coming, and it sucks. It sucks. And the reality of that conflict could be very small. This whole conversation happened, and they heard you, and you got through it, and you're moving on. But it can feel, or you can think, that it's way worse than it is. And often when we were just contemplating a choice, trying to weigh out between bad and worse in the Two of Swords, receiving bad is like, well, crap, this is bad. And that's where our mind really ruminates. The Three of Swords captures that rumination over bad stuff happened as a result of my actions. And I'm having some sort of reflection on that. It doesn't feel great. I think that's what's really captured in the Three of Swords. Moving on in the set, I'm going to look at the Four. This is often called the calm after the storm. And there's, even in this deck and in most, there's a literal storm illustrated on the Three of Swords. The Four of Swords is about recuperating. And, you just had all this action in the 1, 2, 3, where you had to make a difficult choice, are facing the difficult consequences, and after you've faced them, you need to recoup. And I like that as we observe kind of the progression of our mental airy element, there is a space along the journey that is about recharging and is about, I just expended myself in a really taxing way doing something that was really hard, and now I just need a day off. The Four of Swords is about that respite. It's about not thinking and about not doing anything, and how important that is for our mental recuperation after a lot of action. And there's a lot of clarity that can come forward from this meditative space. But once we clear away everything, it becomes clear, okay, so that happened, that was rough, what's left? And this is the moment where we kind of come to our senses about, how bad is it really in reality? What am I still facing later in terms of consequences about that choice? And how did it really go? I just needed some time to get over the reaction of, I had consequences happen of my actions in the 3. Leads us to an interesting place in the progression here once we arrive at the 5. 5 of Swords is often about, this is the like, well, I got away with it moment. I asserted myself and I kind of gained some stuff from it because now maybe my boundaries with this theoretical coworker are being respected. And I felt like I had to do things that I wouldn't have done normally, or that I didn't think were the right thing to do. In this case, in my example, my story was someone who wasn't asserting their own needs enough. So they had this idea that they could assert their needs in a relationship or in a space where they previously hadn't really considered it an option or the right option. So the 5 of Swords is this moment where you're like, well, what can't I do? And this is often called the Pyrrhic victory or the swindler. The 5 of Swords, it pictures someone who has got all these swords, and there's 2 other people in the background that he kind of like scammed them out of, pulled a fast one on him and got a shady deal and walked away with all these swords, but at what cost? At what moral cost? And there's kind of this moment in the 5 of Swords where you're like, well, I could do those things in the 1 and 2 that got me somewhere. What more can I do? And this begs the question of what can I do if I'm not holding myself back morally? I'm being pointed at off screen because there's stuff in the chat. Josh says, so it's not necessarily a good outcome. When we're talking, I assume that question came to me here while I was speaking to the 5. And no, I don't think that when I'm reading the outcome of the 5, I don't necessarily read it as good or bad. I don't think that's inherently defined in this card. I do think that it's about getting your way by whatever means, and usually some underhanded or some manipulative means. But it can be, and when I say getting your way by any means, I really mean any. They don't have to be manipulative, and there's some room in my interpretation with this card where I'll fill in that blank intuitively while I'm interpreting it, and you might come to different conclusions with the 5 of Swords. But there is usually some gain, some amount gained. And maybe you could call that a, quote, good outcome, that you did gain something through whatever methods you employed in the Five of Swords. Sorry if there's the noise of barking dogs or whatever else. Thank you, Sonora off screen, for closing the windows.
Oh, he's so cute.
It's apparently a cute dog. But anyway, for whatever you've gained, by whatever means, in the Five of Swords, you've gained it. And it kind of leads me into the Six, where you're more questioning now. I gained it, but at what cost? The Six of Swords is the one that asks, but at what cost? The Six of Swords is often called a journey of sorts, a spiritual or intellectual journey of self-discovery, and it's definitely a period of reflection. You're kind of reflecting on everything that I've done in the set up until now, these first five, and especially my questionable actions in the five. I'm now really wondering. I forgot to keep it grounded here in my example. I'm now kind of. I'm going to go back and bring my analogy up to speed in the Five of Swords. Thanks for the hearty laughing out loud there in the chat, Josh. In the five, let's say I went back to the workplace and I started really asserting my needs with no concern for other people. Anytime anything happened that I didn't like, I just started telling them I don't want to be treated that way. And I started to be given a lot more space at work. And in some ways I like that. In some ways I'm not sure. And that's when I'm arriving at the Six. Here at the Six of Swords. It's this process of self-discovery, because you're kind of learning, what does this say about me? Who am I as a person if I'm acting in this different way? I kind of donned this new way to act in the Ace of Swords at the beginning here, started putting it into practice, and now I'm asking, who am I? What am I about? And trying to understand that to give me a better idea of what are my principles that I govern myself by. These are the questions you're kind of asking and moving towards through experience, through action in the Six of Swords. There's always pictured in the Six of Swords, and I want to mention this character, there's this figure in the boat that's hooded and covered. That's the proverbial you in the picture here. And then there's the one on the back that's paddling. And this person on the back is sometimes a ghostly figure, but is always unnoticed, or usually unnoticed, by the person in the boat. And the point is that there's a lot about your actions or other people in your circumstance that are helping you, guide you towards the answers to these questions. Who am I? The way that your actions play out often guide you toward the answer. Who am I, and what are my morals? What are my principles? And that's not always clear in the moment that you're here, kind of questioning yourself. It's not always clear that the answers are still unfolding and it really is coming to you. And this is interesting. So once you're here and you're halfway towards admitting to yourself that I don't like all the choices I've made or how I've made them, it kind of leads us to the Seven. Seven of Swords is an interesting card, and I spoke about it very briefly before I really got started here with the stream. But it's really about concealment, in a word. And I see it kind of following here, where now, well, I've got some new ideas about how I want to assert myself. I'm going with my example here. But I don't want to do it in a way that's just walking over other people and completely disregarding them. Some stuff that I discovered in the Six. So I don't know how to go forward from here exactly. Now I'm going to work and I'm getting stink eye from some people and space from others, and I'm kind of like trying to not have it all fall apart. I don't want people just resenting me and coming at me. So I'm just gonna play my hand kind of closer to my chest, and be a little kind of deliberate about what I do and don't say. I just realized that one of my lights turned off. Come Come back. And yeah, it's about tactful concealment. You know, this is the realizing that I don't need to share everything about what I'm thinking all the time, and that can often help me get ahead, or at the very least not set me back. I don't need to approach everyone in the office about how sorry I am for the subtle shift in mindset that created some subtle changes around me. It's just not appropriate. That would just be dredging up a whole bunch for nothing, or for little. And so instead, I'm just going to kind of keep it to myself and keep working out my thoughts. There's a lot about the Seven of Swords. They talk a lot about concealment and keeping things from other people. But I think that there's a lot of power and importance in the privacy of our thoughts. And that the Seven of Swords is always talking about thoughts that you're not really ready to share. This is still one that's developing and germinating for me. I'm working on some of the revelations I had in the Six. I'm having some really transformative thoughts about how I think of myself and how I want to present myself. But I'm not quite ready to talk about it in the public eye. I'm not there. So I'm kind of skirting the issue. I'm going to work, going through the motions, keeping everything surface level, Seven of Swords in my way, and it's good, you know? Getting through it. There's a lot about how we can function with some very troubling thoughts and present ourselves effectively with some very troubling thoughts. And the Seven of Swords, I think, gets a bad rap sometimes, but I don't hate it. Of course, I should, as I'm offering my definitions for these cards, follow it with the caveat that every reader is going to have a slightly different interpretation of a card. And I don't think any of them are wrong. The beauty of the cards is that they are an intuitive tool for us to kind of use however we see fit. And a lot of kind of common and accepted definitions have been made for them, especially in the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot system that I'm so familiar with and that I'm teaching here. And that can give you some commonality in the language of the cards with other readers. But it's really important to remember that your own experience of the cards, how they appear to you in your own readings and in your own life, is going to have their definitions evolve and change to you. And the ideas that I'm offering you now about the cards will change their meaning a little bit for you. So whatever about the cards that I present that you either accept or reject is fine. And it's all up to you to take in what you want for them to mean, because you're really just strengthening your language with the divine when you're deepening your understanding or your definition for these cards that on their own are just cardstock. It doesn't say anything. You do. We do. We decide what they mean. That being said, a lot of my definitions of the cards are fairly close with their given Rider-Waite definitions, but I'll have my own deviations here and there, I'm sure. And I'm sure that'll be pointed out to me. I see you in the chat there, Angie and Tim. Yes, the Seven of Swords, you mentioned it in the workplace. Yes, it is so appropriate in the workplace. That is where it functions. Because we've got work to do, and we're saying the work is more important than all these other issues. And so I'm just going to not address those other issues, and now we can just focus on the work. We're functioning! Seven of Swords. Not a bad thing all the time. The Eight of Swords, which I've been holding and not talking about for a little while, the end of the set is going to talk about some cards that are more uncomfortable and less pleasant spaces that we kind of visit in the human experience. And they exist, so there's cards for them. And a lot of times people get hung up on good cards versus bad cards. And I've always preached, I'm very neutral to it all. Depending on the context, a card could be either. But I will admit that these last in the Swords set definitely talk about some uncomfortable experiences that are going to fall on people's scary bad cards lists more than others. The Eight of Swords is about feeling trapped. There's a figure that's surrounded by swords and is bound and blindfolded. A big part of the picture here is that the things that you couldn't touch on in the Seven of Swords here, that we're not talking about, are now very much limiting what I can do. I feel almost trapped by everything that's been built up before this moment. It seems like there are a lot of choices that are unavailable to me by the system of rules I've now made for myself. I'm like, well, I can't do that because I didn't like how I behaved in the Five of Swords, and I reflected on it in the Six, so I don't want to do that. And I can't do that because that's not valuing my needs. And that was the whole point of this revelation in the beginning when I was at the Ace. And I can't do that because that's overstepping my grounds. And it's whatever, it's just the Eight of Swords is about feeling like, well, now what do I do? There's nothing left. I'm having to conceal or not do anything just to get by. And it's an interesting space. The Eight of Swords also has this story where, pictured here, it's important to recognize that the figure's blindfolded, and that's a symbol that's coming back again to represent that they can't, from their position, from this experience of, I've been walking on eggshells at work this past week, just not talking about the issue. Everyone's treating me differently and not exactly the way I like, but I was kind of trying to be asked to be treated differently. Feel kind of stifled. And now I just feel like there's not much to do about it. But the whole point of this Eight of Swords is that there is a reality of you can just walk straight forward. There's no swords there. There's a clear path right in front of this person. But they're blindfolded and tied to a sword. And if they lean right or lean left, they feel a sword there. So it feels as though they're surrounded and they can't see that there is a clear way out of it. And a lot of times these swords are about spelling out how our experience and our thoughts about a situation can be more dramatic than it actually is. And that's illustrated in subtle ways, like this path right ahead of the person in this card. A lot of times there is an obvious answer that's not being considered because this late in the cycle, now that we've reached the 8, it's complicated. There are a lot of very complicated rules that I've started coming up for myself in the 6 and the 7 that have made the issue of what do I do now non-trivial. And I feel trapped by the complexity of it, is often what's happening later in the cycle here. Before all these cycles are meant to repeat. So the story does kind of wrap all the way around. So you'll see where this is going, how we're feeling trapped, and then we suddenly, by the end of it, come back to it being really simple and just like, oh, why don't I just not feel guilty about asserting my needs? And that's the next Ace of Swords. That sets us on a whole different cycle of trying to find a new way to do this. But at this phase in the cycle, we are feeling trapped by that guilt that's coming up. Or the Ace of Swords could be, like, well, I feel guilty about certain ways that I asserted myself, and I can assert myself differently, or what have you. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself because there's still a 9 and a 10. I'm going to talk for a moment about the 9. The 9 of Swords is another one of these dark and gloomy cards. This card captures anxiety more than any card in the tarot deck to me. Just the raw experience of worrying about all the things that could go wrong. When you're stuck, at first it was just the 7 of Swords, I'll just not talk about it and it'll be okay, under the rug. And then it grew into an 8 of Swords. Well, now I can't do anything and I just feel trapped. This is not great under the rug exactly. Some of it's great, but And then it's evolving into the 9 of the, oh my gosh, what if it all goes spectacularly wrong? What if some of these cats get out of the bag and I have to face all this conflict? What if I'm confronted by these coworkers that are like, yo, you've been acting different and it's been crappy and we're done with it. This 9 of Swords is just the worrying about all the things that could go wrong. And this late in the cycle, there's a lot at stake. There's a lot that's been built up. What if I'm fired? Oh, goodness. I've been working so hard to keep this job. What if I, just so much this late in the cycle, this late in the story, by the 9, that could go wrong. And the 9 of Swords is really about the mental rumination over all the things that could go wrong. It is not necessarily the suggestion that things are actually all poised to go wrong, but it does indicate that there's a lot that you're worried that could. And it's fair to mention that there may also be a lot of things that could go wrong. I'm not going to take that away from the card or from any of us when we're feeling anxious. Sometimes our anxieties and fears are totally justified. And you're feeling anxious due to a legitimate circumstance like that. And that I leave up to my intuitive read in the moment. This is the second time I feel like I've mentioned there's some wiggle room. Even this many years later, in my definitions of the cards, there's some wiggle room for me to see it a little bit one way or another, depending what is intuitively suggested to me in the moment that it comes up in conversation, or based on the context of how it was drawn, or what position it is in a spread that I set for it before, will bring forward different elements or slightly different interpretations for a card for me. But in essence, worrying about everything. And I'm gonna transition into the 10 here, where a lot of this is funny. We could talk about the law of attraction for a moment, about how often the things that we expect or that we think about are drawn to us. So there is a certain reality where if we worry about things that maybe even weren't happening, I end up acting just a little more standoffish over the course of this next week while I'm in the 9 of Swords with all my coworkers, and I'm a little prickly and a little paranoid, and I just end up putting people off in a way that does get them to snap at me, just the way I was fearful of. And that realization, that culmination, is represented in the 10 of Swords. There's, just like in the 9 where I was talking about worrying about things that may not actually be happening, the 10 can be feeling like everything went terribly. And I should talk for a moment about this illustration. 10 is often referred to as hitting rock bottom, and just reaching those very, very low points. This card captures the depths of depression. This card captures the depths of feeling failure. This card captures all of those dark, sad, nasty things. Had to be resembled somewhere in the tarot deck. We're trying to use a system here that resembles the whole of human experience, so we can really have a whole conversation about it. The 10 of Swords talks about that. Things going poorly, and just the feeling and experience of, now it's really happened. It's all come crashing down. And there is often the interpretation of the 10 of Swords that it's not as bad as it seems. Oftentimes I've seen people read that. It's a fun, optimistic slant. Sometimes it's very true. And the message from the 10 of Swords can be more of a trying to pull yourself out of a dark, deep, low place and recognize that reality is more on your side than you realize. But more than often than not, the 10 of Swords is about recognizing your fears manifest. The fears that we had in that 9, seeing them crop up and really happen in the 10. It's just the experience of that low. Crap. Really happened. That coworker, our relationship became a little strained, and we just weren't talking about it in the 7, and it just felt like more and more I was walking on eggshells in the 8, and I just couldn't do anything without seeming to piss him off. And by the 9, I was like, oh my gosh, that coworker hates me now. It's so obvious. It's spelled across their face. I dread seeing them every day at work. I'm just waiting for it all to come ahead. This is the day where they really snapped. That they made that comment, because we were both being cold and around each other for this long. This was the day that it really finally came to a head. And I want to harken back to how the cycle repeats itself. Because it's very interesting to draw this connection between from the 10 back to the ace, where once I've hit rock bottom, there's an interesting and very optimistic read of this card where there's nowhere here from here but up. After this point, things can only look up. This resembles the feeling the worst of it, being at that absolute low. And once you are kind of in it and through it for a little bit, and you start asking the what now question, it kind of can grow into that Ace of Swords, where suddenly there's this, well, even after or in the midst of this rock bottom Ten of Swords, you know, I didn't lose my job, or you start to recognize the silver lining. We had that argument, but we're still working on our relationship. We're both still working in the same department. It seems like we're getting through it. And suddenly, things that I thought were the absolute worst possible reality would totally ruin everything are now something that are a part of my reality that's ongoing that I have to reconcile. I'm suddenly like, wow, I have this really challenging relationship with my coworker that came to a head in an ugly way, and we went back to work again on Wednesday because life goes on. And suddenly I've got this whole new way of seeing my relationship with this coworker that I just really couldn't have imagined before this storied experience with it. And I woke up on Wednesday feeling really differently about it and questioning how I can do it differently or what I want to do differently. What now? And we're at it again. Wednesday, we're in with this new mindset. And Thursday, we're back here with, oh, do I just do this whole song and dance again? Or do I just grit my teeth this time? Or is there a different way I can present myself or a different way I can approach it? The cycle repeats. But they all describe different places about our mental experience of life. And it's really the focus with the swords. And it's important to remember when you're reading with tarot that the minor arcana that each belong to their own suit have a very limited scope about what they apply to. And that's what gives them some really clear direction in what they communicate in a reading. There's a lot implied about the emotional experience of something like the Ten of Swords or the Three of Swords, which literally has the heart pictured in it. But the swords element is really referring to the mental experience, strictly. And it's important to remember that we as human beings are whole creatures who have simultaneous mental and emotional experiences, and there will be an emotional component that's experienced with this Three of Swords. So that's kind of part of the read. But not to get carried away with how much of that emotional component is always going to manifest when you're in the Three of Swords, where you're just feeling regret for a past choice that you made, and how it will manifest differently for different people who are maybe in a different place with it. You know, I'm at a Three of Swords, but I came at it from, you know, my relationship with this coworker is always trying, and I know it's going to be hard. And today I told them that it's too much running this cycle all the time, and it's ridiculous, and can't we just get over it? I'm ready to put it behind me. Are you? And they didn't necessarily receive that great. You know, they sort of grumbled about it, and they didn't really necessarily meet me, but they didn't reject it outright. And now things are kind of tense, and it's because of me. It's because I went ahead and Two of Swords jumped in and said, just for once, just back off. I'm ready to grow up. Are you? And here we are in the Three of Swords again, where I'm like, yes, I know I probably hurt them with that. I can visibly see that they're hurt. There's still turmoil, and we're in the midst of that turmoil. But, you know, from that position, I'm talking to that person, that feeling, do you regret it? And that person may say, no, I don't necessarily want to say I regret it. Even though just a moment ago I told you, I think that this could be summed up as regret in a word, kind of, but really it's just about the fallout from the choices you made, and that'll feel differently depending on the circumstance and the feelings that you bring into it. The swords really talk about what we think and the decisions we make and what we value and how we make judgment. And a little more than that. The rest of the context of how it feels to be in a Five of Swords. To some people, the Swindler card here might feel super grimy, awful. Whenever they're in this space where they're getting what they want but not the way they wanted, they might feel awful. Some people might have a lot less reservation about this and just feel like, oh, this is just me winning. Great, I got all the swords. No qualms. Fine. These sword cards can feel very differently depending on the context that they're caught in or the person that's in them. But I mean, I'm just repeating myself now. Swords don't talk about feelings directly. They talk about thoughts. Goodness, if we want to talk about feelings, I could go over all the hearts. If there's anything about tarot or about doing readings that anyone would like to learn, feel free to drop it in that chat. I've got an eye on it. But in the absence of that, I will just go ahead and pull out my cups. I've got a tarot deck here that I've actually ordered for the purpose. It's really, really nice to take a tarot deck and put it in order and lay it all out in front of you when you're learning, because you get to just really get to study it and all the connections between the cards. I ordered this deck so that I could pull it up for our stream. For the shuffle. An unshuffled deck for the shuffle. Oh, the cups. Josh asks a question. Do you not use the king? No, I do use the court cards. Let's go back to the swords for a moment. You caught me there. I do see that there's a cycle from ace to 10. I don't necessarily read my court cards as a part of that cycle. I see them more as characters embodying their element, in this case swords with air, and manifesting it with either different amounts of masculine or feminine characteristics or different levels of development between kind of our juvenile page, our adolescent knight, and our adult king and queen. I will talk about these for a moment. Court cards, I think, are best understood when you understand the overall qualities of the element. These represent characters who act with kind of embody those qualities of the element. The Page of Swords is our free-thinking, kind of young and defiant, I don't want to be told what to do, I want to do what I want to do, kind of character who's exploring the world and wants to be free to do anything because they're open-minded, they're air, they're experimental, they're curious, and they want to take a little stab at everything and just try it out and not be committed to it, so they can pull out and stab into the other thing instead and try that and see what they learn from there. The Knight of Swords is going to, all of these are going to be very similar, of course. All our court cards are embodying the same element, but where the pages are kind of these younger characters who are kind of still learning about the world, and maybe our Page of Swords is really a comfortable liar. We talked a little bit about manipulation and deceit coming up in the swords element. Of these four characters, I see the page being most comfortable doing that. Think of how a child will experiment with lying when they realize they can. And this Page of Swords represents that, absolutely. Just like hasn't yet encountered the what's the drawback of lying? I'm just gonna do it. Five of Swords, just gonna do it. And then, Page of Swords is walking through the six like, oh, now people don't trust me. How's that working? And, I don't see the queen or king lying quite the same way that the page would, or at all. They may a little if it were necessary, if it were tactful, if it were for the greater good. if they had good mental reason that I've evaluated and judged, it's very important that I make this white lie, and I'm going to do it. But the lie coming from a king or a queen of swords is going to have a very different motive to it than the lie coming from a page of swords. I skipped over the knight. I want to talk about knights for a moment. Knights are always very dynamic, forward-moving. I am actively going out trying to change my world characters. Where the page was the young growing up and learning, the knight is eager to be grown up and changing the world. And the swords is one of our most active elements. It's about really fast-moving energy and active decision-making. And the Knight of Swords is someone who does charge right in and say, I have the solution. This is it. Show me another problem. I've got a solution for that. Boom. Show me another problem. And it's just ready to charge right through. One decision after the other, one action right after the other. Not trying to stop. Pictured this knight as like charging forward. And I like that. That's usually true in most of the Rider-Waite decks. You'll notice a difference in the character between this knight and like maybe the Knight of Pentacles, who's much more careful and calculated and isn't charging forward like that until they've really reasoned out every step of the choice that they're going to make, and they understand the full ramifications of the consequences of the choice that they're going to make. But they're still a knight. They're still trying to look forward like that and move forward and make changes. Here, Knight of Swords is the one who charges in with, I've got a new idea, or I've got a way to shake things up that's going to make it better. Our swords are all about idealism and thinking about the better, the best thing, the best way that things could be, striving for that. I'm the Knight of Swords. I'm going to create a utopia. I've already figured out how it's going to happen. It's like this, and this. Don't ask me how, just start doing it. The King and Queen of Swords are probably in the tarot deck the best advisors, because they represent here now the fully matured, whereas the Knight of Swords may sometimes be a little hasty and a little reckless about the action that they take. The Queen and King of Swords here are well measured. You'll notice I've really lumped them together and I'm talking about them at the same time. There are subtle differences in the manifestation of the masculine versus the feminine characteristics of the element cropping up, but there's going to be a lot of overlap between these two characters in how they share the mature aspect of their sign. I would say the King of Swords does a little more straight just giving direction to people, whereas the Queen of Swords is going to do a little more listening and taking input and offering direction based on where you're at. So maybe the Queen of Swords is your counselor that you're talking with and getting some really insightful and enlightening ideas from, because these people represent very mature and developed mental facilities. They are very wise. They have got a grip on the way things usually work. They just understand kind of, when you're in a Five of Swordsy place, you're headed towards a 6. And I can see that you, young Page of Swords, are in the Five of Swordsy place. So I'm going to, as the Queen or King of Swords, give you a tip about what's around the corner that I understand, because I have a very, very wise and thorough understanding of the world and how it works. And I can recognize where you're at in it. I love these characters very much. They, again, do tend to be very heady. So the King of Swords could offer a very hard truths, just like honesty with knives sort of thing, where they're just cutting it dry. This is the way the world is. And yes, it sucks, but that's the truth. And I'm the King of Swords, and as the King of Swords, I'm not burdened as much by my emotions. I operate purely in a very, very cerebral way. So I can tell this King of Swords can make very clear judgment. They're really not muddied by how they feel about something. They're really, really strictly operating on pure. I can spell it out for you. I can write it out for you exactly why I made the choice I did. and what I was valuing when I did. I'll spell it out for you. It was not because it was what I felt was right, it was because I knew it was right. And the King of Swords will come at you with this energy and tell you what to do because they know what's right. And the Queen of Swords knows what's right and is going to guide you to it. And that's maybe the subtle difference in the way that they'd work that. We could get caught up talking about court cards for a long time. And there's a lot about these characters that I think will evolve and grow with you as a reader as you can continue encountering them. But remember any and all of what happens in the minor arcana in their suit, or at least what their element represents, and ask yourself, who is that character? That really embodies these cards, the court cards. And I'd also point out that the context that the card is drawn indicates a lot too. Every now and then, people will actually read the appearance of a court card as an actual person in your life, depending how it appeared in a spread, or as a resemblance of you, your own character. There are a lot of different ways that you can read a court card.